Hi, my name is Reid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to talk about the role of gender in selecting a scapegoat for the narcissistic parent. So I'd like to talk about the gender dynamics that could sometimes be in play when a narcissistic parent selects a child to play the role of scapegoat for him or her. I think this selection process, as it were, is often, occurs unconsciously. But the effects and role played by the parents and the child's gender, I think, deserve some attention. Of course, it's not meant to capture or claim that this is how all narcissistic abuse from a parent to a child occurs, but to lay out how there can at times be somewhat of a specific formula that has to do with both the parents and child's gender that may trigger the narcissistic parent's envy towards the child who ends up becoming the scapegoat for the family. So the first situation I'd like to address is that where the narcissistic parent is a mother, or at least female, and the child is male. And I should make a disclaimer here that I'll be using the term female and male today, I guess, as one identifies themselves to be, not necessarily drawing any allusions to like how someone was born anatomically and so forth, but rather how someone identifies themselves as either male or female. In this type of configuration of a narcissistic mother and a son, a male boy, if the son picks up a sense that the mother reacts to whether it's female siblings, sisters, or women in general, more positively than men or boys in the sort of child's estimation, then it's an understandable conclusion that boy may come to of his being male is the reason for his mother's unhappiness with him. In a way, he wouldn't necessarily be wrong, as I'll hopefully describe a little more when there's a certain dynamic in play here. So if the narcissistic mother happened to have a narcissistic father, or at least self-absorbed father, whom she continued to idealize and never sort of dealt with her anger towards him for the lack of provision of what she needed, then, and part of not dealing with it can also be the perceived consequences of expressing that to such a father who maybe likely would have met that with rebuke, retaliation, or abandonment. And two, she did not have the internal wherewithal to kind of find help elsewhere via therapy, supportive friends, or whatever. Instead maintains this illusion that her own narcissistic father was rather perfect, as it were, and has to push unconscious her own anger at that parent, and that can contribute to her own sense of that core sense of worthlessness that I talked about before. It can be felt by the narcissistic individual. So with that unaddressed, her sort of own anger towards her own narcissistic father, then if she were to have a son who maybe initially is sort of in that halo period of not really having his own sort of sense of free will for, say, the first 2 years of life, or being much more dependent on the mother, as he grows into his own kind of center of initiative and independence, as I've discussed elsewhere, it can re-evoke the memory of kind of how she was shucked aside by her father in his true narcissism, as though that's what her son is now doing by just growing into his own self and inhabiting his own body and paying attention to his own desires and wants. But when this happens to her son, who is still very much, let's say at 2 years old, very much dependent on her, it becomes a much more convenient target for this repressed anger, where she can express to him how enraged and helpless she feels when the son doesn't show her the deference she believes she deserves in this kind of entitled narcissistic way. And because the son is dependent on her, she can express as much anger as she wants without fear of the son abandoning her, he needs her too much, or retaliating, because truly a 2-year-old can't really retaliate the way she may have feared her father, an adult could towards her. So this is one specific configuration where a son can stand in grave threat to evoke his narcissistic mother's sense of worthlessness just by happening to be the same gender as the parent who initially made this narcissistic mother feel so worthless and helpless. Again, that mother's father. And if the mother is narcissistic, that typically is accompanied by a severe lack in empathy and remorse, which will, I think, often prevent her from considering how her own abusive, rage-filled behavior towards the boy might be affecting her son. And as a result, the mother may instead find his presence to be a convenient target or receptacle for her to express her, frankly, even hatred, if not rage, that was really meant for her father towards that potential retaliation or abandonment he would have met her protest with. And yet she gets to kind of apply that against the son without recrimination. And that lack of empathy, in essence, affords her, I think, to not care what happens to that son. But, typically, the boy selected into this scapegoated role has the internal fortitude to be able to bear this kind of treatment without collapsing under its weight. But in a sort of somewhat tragic sense, but also remarkable for the strength of, I think, the scapegoated son, he's sort of left there. There's almost by virtue of his strength to survive it, it doesn't raise flags to say, hey, something's happening here that needs to be addressed from, say, another party. And or another party may not be willing to intervene, certainly within that nuclear family governed by the narcissistic mother in this case. So what are some common beliefs for the scapegoated son that can arise from this kind of narcissistic abuse from a mother? If that boy concludes that his mother only is dissatisfied or even hates him because he's male, then that sort of belief allows him to keep on going in the family, because he may get to determine he can sort of hide his maleness, or at least any enjoyment in being male in the world, and thereby hold out a hope that she might eventually love him if he can just keep this facet of who he is that's really not divorceable from himself, but still keep that facet hidden. She may eventually then love him. Maybe some of the sort of unconscious logic that happens for the boy. And although it helps him to keep going on, it can wreak havoc on his achieving the normal, healthy developmental goals for a developing young male. The joy of being a boy likely would feel forbidden. And at whatever sort of stage in development, whether that includes roughhousing with his friends, playing sports, video games, playing musical instruments of any sort. I don't mean to typecast what constitute male activities, but whatever it is that sort of feels linked to one's identified gender, that, the activities that feel commensurate with that, those will likely feel like something to keep oneself away from, lest they evoke what feels as the sort of hated attribute for the boy. In addition, succeeding in these types of endeavors may feel very dangerous, because it sort of confirms, not just to him, but to others outside, which makes it feel more real, features of his sort of male identity. And then, depending on the boy's developing sexual orientation, pursuing sources of romantic fulfillment outside the home, which feel aligned with one's male identity. And again, I said depending on the sexual orientation, because it could be homosexual or heterosexual, whatever it is, that too can feel very forbidden, because it sort of connects oneself with their specific male identity. Some of the things that might develop as a result of this are sort of finding reasons why one won't be able to, say, succeed in sort of, again, identified male activities, or find romantic fulfillment in relationships outside the family, that one is, say, defective or unattractive or uninteresting, or somehow or another bound to be rejected by the objects of their desire. And then finally, the male survivor of this type of narcissistic abuse may feel, and often and typically very inaccurately, underwhelming compared to other males when they sort of compare themselves. And I think by virtue of having forced to hide one's maleness for so long, that to be in a world where other boys, teenagers, men have had the privilege of having good enough parents support those guys' maleness and and having that sort of those features of their identity promoted, then this survivor of this type of abuse may sort of feel under-equipped to match their zeal or ardor in enjoying and relishing the experience of being male in the world. Again, it can feel like the surviving male doesn't have what it takes, but really that's, I think, an artifact of the perception that had to be imposed in order to sort of survive the sort of destructive intent felt that was coming from the narcissistic mother. So to move on to a different configuration where there's a narcissistic father who selects a daughter for the role of scapegoat. If narcissistic father was raised by or physically or emotionally abandoned by a narcissistic mother, and similarly to the narcissistic configuration I just described, that the father continues to idealize that narcissistic mother, into his adulthood, then that unaddressed anger towards that mother could very well undeservedly get pointed in the direction of a daughter. In these cases, and just like discussed before, the father may see the daughter as his special little partner until the daughter starts to seek and be interested in sources of romantic fulfillment outside of the family. Because that may evoke the narcissistic father's own feelings of worthlessness or anticipation of being rejected, as he may have experienced from his continuing to be idealized narcissistic mother. And I think one of the consequences for the daughter surviving this type of abuse may well be that she has to hide her own sort of femaleness, however she feels and connects to that concept's experiential sense, both hide that from her father and maybe from herself. So again, striving for sort of normal, healthy developmental milestones of kind of maturing into one's female identity can feel too dangerous to undertake. Whether that means, again, however it's defined, again, finding sources of happiness outside the home, connecting with friends, and so forth. For scapegoated sons of a narcissistic father, there may be less of a conclusion that the problem for the son is that he is male, but rather that he is not enough of a male to measure up to the narcissistic father. At least that's what sort of the conscious conclusion may be. There's a book and movie called The Great Santini that I think is a good example of this relationship between a narcissistic father and his son. In these cases, the danger is often of the male son outdoing the narcissistic father, because to outshine that narcissistic father sort of threatens to kind of connect that father with that sense of worthlessness that he combats by feeling this artificial sense of superiority, particularly to the son who's in the scapegoated role. One potential dynamic from which the narcissistic father may come from is one where he was the sibling of a scapegoated child in his family of origin, where he maybe learned or adapted by boosting his own self-esteem from knowing this other sibling was sort of beneath or lower than him. Similar to perhaps how his own maybe narcissistic parent treated that sibling. That is, this narcissistic father may have identified with his own narcissistic parent. So as a result, any show of prowess on the part of the son, or the scapegoated son, would gravely threaten that father's fragile sense of superiority and inflated self-worth. And some of the common beliefs that can result from a son having to deal with a narcissistic father is that they have to sort of essentially tackle life with one hand tied behind his back, the son's back. And, for instance, one, again, mythical client recovering from this type of situation would describe how he could muster all of his talents and skills towards a goal at work only after the chips were against him. So this might mean falling behind on assignments or finding it impossible to get going on a project that he's supposed to do, and only after several reprimands from a supervisor would he find it, in essence, safe enough or relief from danger enough to work on what he had to work on, because now he was saving his job rather than succeeding and sort of building himself up in the company, because it's that build-up that would have proven so gravely dangerous for him in relation to a narcissistic father, where this sort of gender dynamic is in play. And now moving to sort of daughters who are chosen as a scapegoat by a narcissistic mother, I think one thing that can happen in this dynamic is that they get targeted for being, say, bolder in temperament than the mother was or felt capable of being. Again, this is just one particular configuration with a narcissistic mother and scapegoated daughter, but it can lead to similar outcomes as scapegoated sons of narcissistic fathers I was just discussing, where the daughter may have come to the conclusion that she's only sort of despised or punished by her mother, her narcissistic mother, for speaking out too much or being too bold in her expressions, and as a result kind of grow vigilant with herself to sort of hold her tongue or not express herself spontaneously, lest she court the disaster of losing her mother's very tenuous goodwill towards her. I think in these kinds of cases it's particularly maybe salient, the mother's own sense of envy over this type of daughter's sort of like natural exuberance towards speaking out into the world. Because if that narcissistic mother feels undeserving of having a say or a voice in the world, then seeing a daughter naturally act this way can evoke that sense of envy, and that, envy being the sort of coveting of what the daughter has and wanting to destroy the daughter, again, psychologically speaking, for possessing it. And so daughters of such mothers, or scapegoated daughters of such mothers, may report feeling like they were always being watched or reprimanded for talking back to teachers, other parents, etc. In effect, sort of feeling like their natural way of being in the world was too big or even insulting to others, and that they always had to watch themselves so as not to put others off. A common experience for scapegoated daughters of this kind of narcissistic mother is to just experience a lot of anxiety, because understandably it's like their natural way of being is believed to be detrimental to themselves in a needed relationship at the time with the mother, so that they sort of have to be at odds with themselves much of the time. And it may even kind of extend to feeling like whatever personal or professional success they've enjoyed in life was only won by being acceptable enough and watching that they don't, watchful that they don't say or do the wrong thing that would bring the same kind of punishment or approbation that their mother would so readily visit them with. Well, thanks for tuning in this week. Again, I wanted to kind of cover the gender dynamics that can be in play when there's a narcissistic father scapegoating a son or a daughter, or a narcissistic mother scapegoating a son or a daughter, because they're sort of different, I think, in each configuration, I think worth thinking about and paying some attention to, more particularly with an eye towards as survivors are in the recovery process, thinking about how their own relationship with their kind of gender identity has felt, and if there's been a need at one point or another to sort of smush or hide this very important part of who one is in order to survive this form of abuse, and how that can kind of gently be brought back into the fore and get to be integrated and lived with as a very central part of one's identity as more safety gets to be felt in the recovery process. Well, thank you again for tuning in and your continued support of the channel. I look forward to posting again next week, Sundays at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.